The clock on the glass wall blinked 6:47 a.m., its red digits the only pulse in a room made of silence and skyline. From her corner office, Eleanor Ross stood motionless, watching the city stretch awake beneath her. 1,000 windows caught the sunrise, yet none of them looked warm. Her reflection stared back, tailored navy suit, dark hair in a perfect twist, eyes that had memorized the art of composure. Success, power, precision, everything in its place. Except her heart, which felt like a locked drawer she no longer had the key to. The scent of espresso drifted in before she heard the soft knock. "Come in." The door opened, and Jamie walked in, sunlight finding her before Eleanor did. 25, sharp and soft in equal measure, the kind of beauty that didn't ask to be noticed but somehow always was. Her blouse was pale ivory, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her brown hair falling in loose waves that caught every glint of light from the window. She held a folder close to her chest, her nails short and neat, her voice calm when she spoke. "Morning, Ms. Ross. The quarterly notes you asked for." Eleanor nodded without looking up at first, still pretending to read an email she'd already memorized. But when she finally raised her eyes, the air between them shifted, almost imperceptibly, like the faint hum before thunder. Jamie's gaze held hers a moment too long before lowering to the folder, her pulse visible in her throat. "Thank you, Jamie. Leave them on the desk." "Of course. Anything else before your call with the London team?" Eleanor hesitated. "No," she meant to say, but the word stayed behind her teeth. She just shook her head instead. Jamie smiled, that half-smile that looked both confident and careful, then left the room. The faint scent of her perfume, jasmine and rain after stone, lingered behind, too human, too alive for a place built of steel. The day unfolded in meetings, data, voices layered over the hum of machines. Yet every time Jamie passed by, Eleanor felt her rhythm falter, the brush of fabric near her shoulder, the sound of a quiet laugh from the hall. She'd built an empire on control, but this was something else. Something unpredictable, dangerous in its softness. That evening, when most of the office lights dimmed, Jamie was still there, across the open floor, rearranging files, a single earbud tucked in, humming faintly. Eleanor leaned on the glass wall, watching her reflection overlap with Jamie's silhouette. The contrast struck her, the young assistant framed by the muted amber of desk lamps, moving with a grace that seemed unaware of its own power. "You're still here." Jamie turned, startled but smiling. "You said the Paris contract needed review by morning." "I did, didn't I?" "You did. But I don't mind late nights. The city feels quieter up here." Eleanor walked toward her, the soft click of heels against marble filling the silence. "Quieter, or lonelier?" Jamie tilted her head, thinking. "Maybe both. But sometimes lonely feels honest." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The elevator chimed somewhere distant, a horn echoed from the street below. Then Eleanor cleared her throat, breaking whatever had formed in that fragile air. "Go home, Jamie. You've done enough." Jamie nodded, gathering her papers. "Good night, Ms. Ross." "Eleanor, when it's just us." The name hung between them like a secret. Jamie looked at her, uncertain whether it was an invitation or a test. "Good night, Eleanor." When the door closed, Eleanor leaned back against her desk, feeling her heartbeat where it shouldn't be, in her throat, her wrists, her skin. Through the glass, she could see Jamie walking down the hallway, her figure shrinking into distance and reflection until the elevator doors swallowed her whole. That night, Eleanor returned home to a penthouse that smelled of polished wood and absence. Her husband's briefcase sat by the door, untouched since morning. On the counter, a note, "Dinner with investors. Don't wait up." She placed her keys beside it and stared at the words until they blurred into meaninglessness. Upstairs, she undid her hair, the pins clinking like quiet confessions. She turned on no lights, letting the city's glow spill through the windows, 1,000 lives she'd never touch. Her phone buzzed. A new email from Jamie, final revisions attached. "Sleep well." She almost replied. Almost wrote, "You too," or "Thank you," or "I wish you were still here." But she didn't. She just stared at the blinking cursor until it disappeared. In another part of the city, Jamie lay in her small Brooklyn apartment, the hum of traffic replacing the lull of the office. She scrolled through her phone, rereading Eleanor's old messages about schedules and meetings, smiling at how formal they sounded now. Then she placed the phone on her chest and closed her eyes, trying not to think about the way Eleanor's voice softened when she said her name. Back in the glass tower, Eleanor stood by the window again, barefoot this time, her reflection fractured by the lights below. Somewhere far beneath her, the city buzzed, unaware of the storm quietly forming between two women who hadn't even touched yet. And as the first taxi light curved across the street, she whispered the words she hadn't dared to send. "Good night, Jamie." Monday mornings at Ross and Vale Technologies always smelled like ambition, coffee, cologne, and nerves. But for Eleanor, that morning carried a different current. She could sense it before she even reached her office, the faint sound of laughter from inside. Jamie was there, sleeves rolled up, rearranging files and muttering to herself about how the printer had a personal grudge. Eleanor paused by the door, watching for a moment before speaking. "I'm starting to believe you talk to machines, not people." Jamie turned, startled but smiling. "Only the ones that listen." "Do they?" "Better than most board members." Eleanor laughed, an unexpected, unguarded sound that seemed to surprise them both. It had been years since anyone made her laugh in that office. The sound lingered like sunlight between them. Over the next few weeks, their rhythm changed. Mornings began with coffee already waiting on Eleanor's desk, perfectly how she liked it, no sugar, 2 drops of cream. Afternoons stretched into quiet moments of collaboration, screens glowing, papers spread, fingers brushing when they both reached for the same page. The city outside pulsed with life, but the 47th floor became its own universe. They started sharing small pieces of themselves between deadlines. Jamie told stories about her college days in Boston, about her roommate who burned pancakes every Sunday. Eleanor listened, chin resting on her hand, amused and captivated in equal measure. In return, she spoke about her early years in tech, about the thrill of risk before everything became numbers and strategy. "You don't really sleep, do you?" Jamie asked one night, glancing up from her laptop. "Sleep feels like surrender." Maybe surrender isn't always bad. Eleanor looked at her, the faintest smile curving. "Careful, Jamie." That almost sounded like advice. Maybe it was. That week, a problem arose. The European investors requested Eleanor's presence in Zurich, a critical presentation. Jamie was to accompany her for support. It was strictly professional, but the thought of long flights, hotel rooms, shared hours between time zones stirred something wordless in both of them. The night before the trip, Eleanor stayed late reviewing slides. Jamie entered quietly, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Fuel," she said. "You'll need it." The air conditioner hummed softly, the city lights flickered against the glass. Eleanor took a sip, eyes never leaving Jamie's. "You're too young to be this composed. And you're too brilliant to look this tired." It wasn't flirtation, not exactly. But it lived somewhere in that space where honesty and desire overlap. The flight to Zurich was wrapped in silence and subtlety. Eleanor sat by the window, reading reports, Jamie beside her, pretending to sleep. Their arms brushed whenever the plane shifted, sending quiet ripples of awareness through both. The scent of Eleanor's perfume, cedar and faint vanilla, mingled with the recycled cabin air, creating an intimacy neither could name. At the hotel, there had been a mistake with the booking. Only one suite available, 2 bedrooms, but one shared living space. Eleanor, irritated at first, accepted the keycard with a sigh. "We'll survive," she said. Jamie smiled. "It's not survival, it's logistics." That night, the suite filled with soft jazz from the radio. Jamie worked on the couch, her laptop glowing against her bare feet. Eleanor emerged from her room in a silk robe, hair damp from the shower, holding a glass of wine. The air smelled of citrus shampoo and rain from the open balcony. "You don't have to keep working, Jamie." "I know. But I like finishing what I start." Dangerous philosophy. They looked at each other across the room, CEO and assistant, command and devotion, tension and safety. Eleanor crossed to the balcony, the night wind moving the curtains around her. "Do you ever think," she said softly, "that we spend our lives climbing towers just to realize there's nothing at the top?" Jamie closed her laptop. "Maybe the view's worth it, if someone's beside you." The words landed like touch. Eleanor turned, meeting Jamie's gaze. The air between them shimmered, electric, quiet, alive. Jamie stood, walked to the balcony door, and stopped within a breath's distance. "You should rest, Ms. Ross. Big day tomorrow." "Eleanor. When it's just us." "Then rest, Eleanor." Their eyes met in the dim light, city reflections dancing across their faces. For a heartbeat, they both leaned slightly forward, a motion too instinctive to control. Then Eleanor's phone vibrated on the table, slicing the moment apart. She stepped back, exhaling, half in relief, half in regret. Jamie smiled faintly, hiding the tremor in her voice. "Tomorrow, then. After the presentation." Eleanor nodded. After the presentation. When Jamie disappeared into her room, Eleanor stood by the balcony again, wind catching the loose strands of her hair. Below, Zurich glowed like a constellation, distant, unreachable. She pressed her hand to the railing, feeling the metal's chill ground her in the present. Inside, she could hear the faint sound of water running, Jamie showering, humming softly behind the wall. A melody she didn't recognize, yet it anchored her in ways no victory ever had. She whispered to the night, a confession to no one. "What am I doing?" The city didn't answer. It only flickered, as if keeping their secret. And when she finally turned off the light, the scent of jasmine from Jamie's room lingered in the dark, a promise that tomorrow might not end the way either of them expected. The morning after the Zurich presentation came wrapped in silver fog. The city moved slowly, trams gliding through damp streets, people carrying umbrellas like shields. The meeting had gone perfectly, applause, handshakes, numbers soaring, but Eleanor barely heard any of it. Her focus had been elsewhere, on the way Jamie's sleeve brushed hers when she handed her the laser pointer, on the quiet steadiness in her assistant's gaze that anchored her when her voice trembled. Now, back at the hotel, the adrenaline had faded into a strange, humming quiet. Jamie was packing documents on the couch, a strand of hair falling over her face. Eleanor watched her for a long time before speaking. "You were incredible today." Jamie smiled without looking up. "You make it easy to be." "I don't think anyone's ever said that about me before." Jamie finally met her eyes. Then maybe they weren't paying attention. A beat of silence passed. Then a clap of thunder outside. Rain began to streak the wide glass windows, heavy and persistent. Their flight home was delayed, 2, maybe 3 hours. The announcement came through Eleanor's phone like an excuse from fate. "We're grounded," she said, glancing up. Jamie shrugged, playful. "Guess Zurich isn't done with us." They decided to wait it out. Eleanor opened a bottle of wine, Jamie ordered food. The suite filled with soft jazz again, the smell of rosemary and bread from the tray room service brought. They sat on the carpet near the window instead of the table, Eleanor in her blouse sleeves, Jamie barefoot, legs crossed, laughing at something about airline bureaucracy. "I don't think I've ever seen you laugh this much," Jamie said, her voice low, almost tender. That's because you haven't known me long enough. Maybe. But I think I'm learning fast. Eleanor reached for the bottle at the same time Jamie did. Their fingers met around the glass, warm against warm. Neither moved. The sound of rain filled the pause, drops racing down the window like seconds counting something inevitable. Eleanor exhaled softly, almost a sigh. Jamie's eyes followed the motion of her lips before she blinked and looked away. To break the silence, Eleanor stood. We should probably eat before the bread gets cold. Jamie nodded, though her voice trembled slightly. Sure. They moved to the kitchenette, unwrapping dishes side by side. Steam rose from the plates, carrying scents of butter and garlic. When Eleanor reached for the napkins, she brushed Jamie's arm, and the touch felt like a pulse. Jamie looked up, startled, not by the contact, but by how much she wanted it to continue. Later, when they couldn't stand the walls anymore, they went downstairs. The rain hadn't stopped, and Eleanor's driver had gone home. Jamie laughed when Eleanor frowned at the sky. It's just water. It's freezing. So we'll freeze together. They walked under one umbrella through the narrow Zurich streets. The city glowed, reflections trembling in puddles, the smell of wet pavement and chocolate from a nearby cafe. Their shoulders touched with every step. Eleanor felt her pulse echo through the thin space between them. At one corner, the wind blew hard, pushing the umbrella aside. Rain splashed their faces, their hair. Jamie laughed, grabbing Eleanor's wrist to steady her. The touch lingered. They were both soaked, eyes locked, breath uneven. The world blurred around them, just two women in the middle of a foreign city, suspended in something that didn't need translation. Jamie's voice came first, soft as the rain. You'll catch a cold. Maybe, Eleanor whispered. Maybe not. The umbrella slipped from her hand. Neither of them moved to pick it up. Eleanor reached out, brushing a wet strand of hair from Jamie's cheek. Her thumb paused there, tracing the faint tremor of her jaw. Jamie closed her eyes, not retreating, not rushing, just breathing into the moment. When Eleanor leaned closer, it wasn't planned. It wasn't strategy or mistake. It was gravity. Their lips met like the first drop of rain after drought, brief, trembling, full of unsaid years. A kiss that began in hesitation and ended in the promise of something too fragile to name. When it ended, neither spoke. They stood there, rain tracing cold rivers down their faces, the city humming around them. Jamie's fingers were still curled in Eleanor's sleeve. Eleanor's heart felt too large for her chest. I'm sorry, Eleanor murmured. Jamie shook her head. Don't be. I shouldn't have. You didn't. We both did. They walked back in silence, the umbrella forgotten. Inside the hotel elevator, the mirrored walls reflected versions of them they didn't yet recognize, close, uncertain, alive. Jamie stared at the floor numbers as if they could slow time. Eleanor watched the space between their hands. When the doors opened, Jamie spoke first. Maybe we should just rest. We're both exhausted. Eleanor nodded, though exhaustion was the last thing she felt. Yes. Rest. In her room, Eleanor stood by the door long after it closed, her palm still warm where Jamie's hand had been. She pressed her fingers against her lips, tasting rain and fear and something dangerously close to joy. Through the wall, faintly, she heard movement, drawers closing, footsteps, a sigh. Then silence. She wanted to knock. To say something, anything, to make sense of what had happened. But she didn't. Instead, she turned off the lights and sat by the window again, watching the storm fade into gray. Somewhere out there, a church bell rang midnight. She thought of Jamie, of the softness behind her confidence, the way her laughter had felt like warmth in a life of glass and marble. In that moment, Eleanor knew nothing would ever go back to how it was before. And yet, she wasn't sure she was ready for what came next. She whispered to the empty room. Tomorrow. We'll talk tomorrow. But deep down, she already knew that tomorrow might never come the way she imagined. The rain followed them back to New York. It seemed to cling to the city, to Eleanor's glass office, to her hair, to the silence that had begun to live between them. A week had passed since Zurich, but the memory of that night lingered like perfume on skin. It haunted the edges of every conversation, every glance that lasted a heartbeat too long. Jamie returned to work as if nothing had changed. She was professional, poised, her tone clipped just enough to draw a line neither of them could cross. Yet Eleanor could feel it, that same current beneath the surface, quiet but undeniable. She told herself it would fade. It didn't. The board meeting ran long that afternoon. Eleanor's husband, Richard, was there, his voice sharp as always, dissecting numbers and people with equal precision. When the meeting ended, he placed a hand on her shoulder, not affection, but ownership. Dinner tonight, he said. Investors from Chicago. Be ready by 7. She nodded, already feeling the weight of another evening spent pretending to belong in a life that no longer fit. Back in her office, Jamie was waiting with a tablet and a question she didn't ask aloud. Everything okay? Eleanor hesitated. Fine, she said, too quickly. Jamie didn't move. The faint smell of rain drifted in through the half-open window. You don't look fine. I'm not sure that's your concern, Eleanor replied, but her voice softened halfway through. Jamie took a slow breath. I'm sorry. I care. The words fell between them like something fragile and irreversible. Eleanor closed her eyes. She wanted to say I know. She wanted to say I care too. But the walls had ears, and the city had rules. That night, she sat through dinner beside Richard, nodding at the right times, laughing when expected. Across the table, the restaurant's pianist played a familiar melody, soft, slow, and heartbreakingly close to the tune Jamie had hummed in the Zurich shower. Eleanor's chest tightened. Her hand trembled slightly on the wine glass. When they returned home, Richard poured himself another drink and began reviewing messages. You were distracted tonight, he said without looking up. I'm tired. From what? Sitting. Eleanor stared at him, the man she'd once admired for his drive, now a mirror of everything she had outgrown. She turned away. I have an early morning. In bed, she couldn't sleep. The rain was back again, brushing against the windows. She picked up her phone, hesitated, and typed a message, can we talk? Then deleted it. Typed it again. Deleted it once more. When she finally closed her eyes, she dreamt of water, endless, gray, and pulling her toward a voice she couldn't quite hear. The next day, Jamie was waiting in the lobby when Eleanor arrived, holding 2 coffees. Thought you could use this, she said quietly. Thank you. Their fingers brushed as she handed the cup over. That tiny contact felt louder than any confession. By mid-afternoon, a rumor had started, someone from HR had seen them leave together in Zurich. Eleanor was called into a private meeting with a partner. You need to be careful, he said. Perception matters. Especially for someone in your position. She smiled the way she'd learned to, polite, detached, devastatingly calm. Of course. But when she returned to her office, Jamie was standing by the window, looking out at the gray skyline. They know, Jamie said softly, without turning around. Nothing happened, Eleanor replied. Jamie looked back, eyes searching hers. Nothing. The word hit harder than accusation. It was truth and denial in one syllable. Eleanor wanted to reach for her, but fear coiled like wire in her chest. I can't, she whispered. Jamie stepped closer. Can't what? Feel? Or admit that you already do? The room felt too small, the air too thin. Outside, rain hit the glass like fingertips. Eleanor's voice cracked. You don't understand what I could lose. Maybe it's not about losing, Jamie said. Maybe it's about finally choosing. Silence. Only the hum of the city and the faint echo of thunder somewhere beyond the river. Eleanor turned toward the window, the skyline fractured by water streaks. You make it sound easy. Jamie shook her head. It's not easy. It's just real. Eleanor closed her eyes, and for the first time, she let herself imagine it, a life without the boardrooms, the dinners, the performative smiles. Just mornings filled with laughter, the warmth of a hand that stayed. But the image broke as quickly as it came. Richard's voice echoed in her mind. The board's warning. The articles that would write themselves. Jamie stepped closer until she was just behind her. Eleanor could feel her breath near her neck, steady, patient, waiting for something she wasn't sure she could give. Jamie's hand hovered in the air, almost touching her arm, then stopped. Tell me to stop, and I will. Eleanor turned, slowly, and their eyes locked, everything said without a word. For a long moment, no one moved. Then she whispered, I don't know what's right anymore. Jamie smiled, sad and soft. Maybe right isn't the point. The sound of the elevator arriving broke the spell. Someone knocked on the door, a colleague's voice calling her name. Eleanor stepped back instinctively, every trace of vulnerability vanishing behind the CEO mask. Jamie lowered her gaze, the space between them now a wall again. I'll reschedule your meeting, Jamie said quietly. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. Thank you. When the office emptied that night, Eleanor remained at her desk, the city outside dissolving into a haze of lights. On her phone, a new message blinked, Are you still awake? She typed yes. Then deleted it. Typed we need to talk. Deleted that too. Finally, she wrote only one word, tomorrow, and hit send. Downstairs, Jamie stood beneath the awning, rain soaking her shoes, phone in hand. She read the message, smiled faintly, then slipped the phone back into her coat. When Eleanor turned off the lights and reached for the door, it stayed slightly open, just enough for the hallway light to spill in, faint and gold, like a promise that hadn't yet decided whether to vanish or return. The rain had stopped, but the city still smelled of it, that faint metallic sweetness rising from the streets after a storm. From the 47th floor, New York shimmered beneath a gray morning sky, its glass towers catching what little light they could. Eleanor stood by the window again, her reflection merging with the skyline just as it had on that first night months ago. But this time, she wasn't alone. The door behind her was half open, and Jamie's quiet presence filled the room like sunlight through fog. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence wasn't awkward now, it was full, charged, almost tender. Eleanor could hear the steady rhythm of Jamie's breathing, could feel the gravity that always seemed to pull them closer no matter how hard she tried to resist. Everything that had happened, the Zurich rain, the rumors, the messages never sent, lingered between them, fragile and unfinished. You didn't answer last night, Jamie said softly. Eleanor turned, her expression unreadable for a moment. I didn't know what to say. Then say what's true. The simplicity of it broke her. For so long she had built her world on half-truths, the kind that looked elegant in boardrooms and hollow in mirrors. Now, faced with the quiet honesty in Jamie's eyes, she realized how exhausting it was to live without her own voice. I'm afraid, she said finally. Not of you. Of everything that would follow. Jamie stepped closer, her voice low. Maybe fear is just love waiting to be honest. The line hung in the air, gentle as breath. Eleanor felt something inside her loosen, like a thread pulled free from years of tight stitching. She had spent her life mastering control, yet here was this woman who undid her with kindness. Jamie took another step forward until there was only the soft distance of air between them. You once told me that control made you feel safe. But what if it's the thing keeping you from feeling alive? Eleanor looked at her, at the way her hair caught the morning light, at the steadiness in her gaze. Slowly, she reached out, her hand finding Jamie's. It wasn't a decision born of impulse or rebellion, it was clarity, the kind that arrives quietly after every storm. Their fingers intertwined, a simple gesture that felt like beginning again. Jamie smiled, and for the first time, Eleanor let herself smile back without fear. The city outside seemed to pulse with them, horns, footsteps, voices all blending into something that sounded like life resuming. Hours later, when the office was empty, they sat together on the floor by the window, shoes off, laughter soft and real. Jamie told stories about the future she dreamed of, a small apartment with plants and sunlight, days not measured by emails. Eleanor listened, realizing she didn't want to imagine that world from a distance anymore. You make it sound so easy, she whispered. It isn't, Jamie replied. But it's real. Eleanor nodded, letting the truth of that sink in. She had spent decades chasing permanence, the company, the marriage, the image. And yet, the only thing that felt lasting now was the way Jamie looked at her, as if she saw the person beneath the armor. The next morning, Eleanor met with Richard in their apartment. The air was thick with unspoken things. He didn't look surprised when she said she wanted to end it, perhaps he'd known for years. There was no shouting, no drama. Just two people finally honest about what had already dissolved. I hope you find what you're looking for, he said quietly. I think I already have, she replied. By the end of the week, Eleanor submitted her resignation letter to the board. Whispers followed, headlines speculated. But she no longer felt the urge to explain herself to anyone. Power, she realized, was not in holding on, it was in choosing what to release. Jamie waited for her outside the building, umbrella in hand. The clouds were lifting, the pavement still wet enough to reflect the sky. When Eleanor stepped out, Jamie simply offered her a hand. No words, no questions, just the quiet certainty of presence. They walked through the streets of New York, past vendors opening stalls and taxis honking their impatience. The city smelled like new beginnings, rain, coffee, paper, and hope. At a crosswalk, Eleanor stopped, taking it all in. She glanced at Jamie, who looked back with that same patient curiosity that had undone her from the start. What now? Jamie asked. Eleanor thought for a moment. Now, we live. The words felt foreign and perfect on her tongue. Jamie's fingers brushed hers, not asking, not claiming, just there. And in that small touch, Eleanor felt a lifetime's worth of decisions align into one quiet certainty. Later, as the sun began to set, they stood by the river, the skyline glowing behind them. The wind moved through their hair, carrying the faint hum of the city, a sound that once meant loneliness but now felt like rhythm. Jamie leaned her head on Eleanor's shoulder. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. When they finally returned to the office that evening to collect a few last things, the room was dim and empty. Eleanor walked to the same window where everything had once begun, where she had stood alone, surrounded by light and glass, mistaking height for meaning. Now she stood in the same spot, but the reflection staring back was different. Beside her stood Jamie, their hands entwined, the city below no longer distant but alive. The rain had washed the skyline clean, and the lights glittered like second chances. Eleanor exhaled, the weight of old expectations slipping quietly from her shoulders. Sometimes freedom doesn't come with thunder or applause. Sometimes it arrives in the simple courage to be seen, truly seen, by someone who looks back without fear. She turned to Jamie and whispered, barely audible over the hum of the world outside. Thank you for reminding me what it feels like to be human. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor Ross wasn't chasing success. She was living it. The sun rose pale over the East River, spilling thin streaks of gold through the wide windows of Eleanor's new apartment. The air smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paint. Boxes still lined the walls, remnants of a life she'd unpacked too many times in boardrooms and hotels but never for herself. She stood barefoot, wearing one of Jamie's oversized shirts, her hair loose, her hands around a mug she hadn't let go of since dawn. Jamie was in the kitchen, humming softly to some forgotten melody, her bare feet brushing the cool tiles. She moved like someone who belonged, not just to the space, but to the rhythm of Eleanor's mornings. "You're staring," Jamie said, without turning. Eleanor smiled, voice still low from sleep. "I'm realizing I never knew what morning light looked like before you." Jamie laughed, a sound that broke gently against the quiet. She placed a plate of toast on the counter and walked over, her fingers brushing Eleanor's wrist as she took the mug. "You used to drink coffee like it was a weapon," she teased. "Now you hold it like it's fragile." "Maybe I am," Eleanor murmured. The city outside stirred, the murmur of traffic, the rush of trains, the faraway whistle of a ferry cutting through the gray water. Inside, everything moved slower. Jamie's books were stacked near the window, a single orchid leaned toward the light. They had promised to keep things simple, no luxury, no headlines, just honesty. But honesty, Eleanor was learning, could be both soft and brutal. She had traded her corner office for freelance consulting, learning how to write from home, to think without the sound of footsteps echoing through glass. At first, she thought freedom would feel lighter. Instead, it felt raw, too quiet, too close to herself. Jamie noticed, always. Sometimes she'd pull Eleanor out for walks along the river, rain or shine, insisting that movement helped the mind. Sometimes they'd end up in second-hand bookstores, sitting cross-legged on the floor, reading lines aloud from novels neither had heard of. One afternoon, Eleanor watched Jamie sketch by the window, charcoal lines, rough and quick. "You're not drawing," Eleanor said softly. "You're remembering." Jamie looked up. "Maybe both." She held up the paper, a loose sketch of Eleanor, sitting just as she was, half-lit by the city's glow. The image was unfinished. "I'll never get your eyes right," Jamie whispered. "They always look like they're holding a storm." Eleanor crossed the room, took the pencil from her hand, and drew one soft line, the curve of light across Jamie's cheek. "Then make it our storm." That night, the two of them sat on the small balcony. The river shimmered below, reflecting the city's thousand restless hearts. Jamie leaned against Eleanor's shoulder. "You ever miss it?" she asked. "The office? The noise? The power?" Eleanor thought for a moment. "Sometimes. But not the pretending." Jamie nodded. "I get it. Sometimes I miss who I was before you, the certainty. But then I realize maybe that version of me was just waiting." The words settled between them like music, the kind that didn't need to be played twice to be understood. Weeks turned into months. The world outside moved faster than they did, and yet, somehow, they kept pace with what mattered. There were still days of tension, Eleanor's instinct to control clashing with Jamie's need to breathe. Once, they argued about something small, a dinner invitation Eleanor declined on their behalf. "You don't have to protect me from the world," Jamie said sharply. "I'm not protecting you," Eleanor replied. "I'm protecting us." "But if us means hiding, then what's the point?" The silence that followed was heavy, but it didn't break them. Instead, it forced them to learn new ways of speaking, not in declarations, but in gestures. The next morning, Eleanor left a note by the coffee pot. "You were right. I don't want to live in shadows anymore." Jamie found her later by the river, feeding crumbs to pigeons. No words were needed. She simply slipped her hand into Eleanor's, their fingers fitting together the way seasons follow one another, naturally, inevitably. As autumn settled over New York, the apartment began to feel less like a refuge and more like a home. Jamie started painting again, and Eleanor learned to let silence fill the spaces words once occupied. They'd wake before sunrise, Jamie sketching while Eleanor read. Sometimes, she'd read aloud lines from old poets, about courage, about rebirth. One evening, the power went out. The whole neighborhood drowned in darkness except for the flicker of candles they found in a drawer. They sat on the floor, wrapped in a single blanket, the city hushed around them. You realize, Jamie said, we're still surrounded by glass, even here. Eleanor tilted her head. Then let's turn it into mirrors. Jamie smiled. You always know how to make broken things beautiful. Eleanor reached out, touched her cheek, and whispered, only because you taught me to see. When the lights returned, the city looked softer through the haze of candle smoke. Eleanor rose, walked to the window, and caught her reflection, not the CEO, not the strategist, but a woman living. Behind her, Jamie stood, watching her with quiet pride. For the first time in her life, Eleanor didn't feel like she was looking at what she'd lost, she was looking at everything she'd finally found. Outside, the river moved endlessly forward, never rushing, never turning back. It was as if the world itself was reminding her, love, like water, is not about possession. It's about flow. And so they let it, day by day, learning how to move together, not in perfect harmony, but in truth. It began with a headline. Former tech titan seen with former assistant, a new kind of merger. Eleanor didn't need to read the rest. She closed her laptop before the words could finish bleeding meaning into her morning. Outside, the sky was a flat, indifferent gray, and the coffee on the table had already gone cold. Jamie came out of the bedroom, hair still wet from the shower, humming softly. The song died when she saw Eleanor's face. What happened? Eleanor slid the computer aside. Someone found us. The words carried a weight neither of them was ready for. Jamie walked closer, towel draped over her shoulder. What do you mean, found us? There's an article. Pictures. Zurich. The river. Maybe even here. Jamie sank into the chair opposite her, silent. The faint scent of her shampoo, lavender and lemon, filled the air, clashing with the bitterness of coffee and unease. You think it'll spread? Eleanor laughed softly, without humor. It already has. By afternoon, her phone began to buzz, old colleagues, reporters, even Richard. We should talk, his message read. She didn't reply. She knew what that conversation would sound like, polite outrage, veiled disappointment, his voice dripping with the kind of control that once defined her life. Jamie sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone. They're making it sound like, she stopped herself, the word too cruel to say aloud. Like it's a scandal, Eleanor finished for her. Yes. They always do. The apartment felt smaller that evening, filled with the noise of a world that suddenly remembered her name for all the wrong reasons. Neighbors looked longer in the elevator, even the barista downstairs paused before asking for her order. She could feel it, the subtle shift in how people saw her. Jamie, trying to lighten the air, suggested a walk. The streets were still damp from a brief rain, the air cool against their skin. They walked side by side, coats brushing. Do you regret it? Jamie asked quietly. Which part? Choosing me. Eleanor stopped under a streetlight. The glow painted her face in half shadow, half gold. I've made 1,000 wrong choices in my life, she said. You're not one of them. Jamie's eyes softened, but the worry didn't vanish. Then what do we do now? We live. And we don't apologize for it. Still, the next morning, the board from her old company issued a statement, distancing itself from personal matters. The phrasing stung more than she expected. It wasn't anger that filled her, it was grief. The kind of grief that comes from watching a version of yourself disappear in public. Days passed. Jamie avoided the news, but Eleanor could feel the tension sitting between them like static. At night, Jamie would sketch silently while Eleanor stared out the window. The sound of graphite on paper was the only thing grounding her. One evening, Jamie placed a drawing on Eleanor's desk. It was the two of them, standing by the river, their reflections slightly distorted in the water. "I drew it from memory," she said. Eleanor traced the image with her fingertip. "We look real." "Because we are," Jamie replied. The next morning, Richard called again. Eleanor answered this time. "You've humiliated yourself," he said without preamble. "I liberated myself," she answered. "Is that what you call this? Throwing away your reputation for a phase?" "It's not a phase, Richard. It's peace." There was a pause, then his voice softened, as if pitying her. "You'll regret it. The world doesn't forgive women who make themselves unpredictable." Eleanor smiled to herself, even as her throat tightened. "Then I suppose I'll be unforgettable." She ended the call, walked to the window, and watched the morning fog swallow the skyline. Behind her, Jamie approached, wrapping a hand around her arm. "You okay?" Eleanor nodded, her voice quieter than she intended. "I'm tired of asking for permission to exist." They spent the next few weeks avoiding the noise. They took long walks in Central Park, their fingers brushing when they thought no one was looking. They ate late dinners, danced to old vinyl records, laughed louder than they should have. But still, every now and then, Eleanor caught that flicker in Jamie's eyes, the one that said, "Are you sure you can survive this?" One evening, after dinner, Jamie asked, "Do you ever miss who you were before all this?" Eleanor thought about it. The office. The meetings. The power. "No," she said finally. "But sometimes I miss how easy pretending used to be." Jamie's silence was answer enough. She understood, perhaps too well. Weeks later, a letter arrived from Eleanor's alma mater inviting her to give a keynote on leadership. The irony made her laugh out loud. "Leadership," she said, handing the envelope to Jamie. "I can't even get the mailman to look me in the eye." "Maybe that's exactly why they need to hear from you," Jamie said. "They need to know what freedom looks like when it costs something." Eleanor stared at her, realizing again how much younger Jamie was, and yet, how often she was the one teaching her to breathe. The night before the event, Jamie helped her choose a dress. They stood in front of the mirror together, their reflections side by side. Eleanor turned slightly, watching Jamie in the glass. "You realize," she said softly, "you've become the voice I listen to when I start doubting everything." Jamie smiled. "Then I'll keep whispering until you believe me." The next day, Eleanor walked onto that stage, not as a CEO, not as a woman defined by scandal or power, but as herself. She spoke about failure, about courage, about how sometimes losing your place in the world is the only way to find your place in it. The applause at the end wasn't thunderous, but it was honest. Backstage, she found Jamie waiting with a small bouquet of lilies, her favorite. The smell filled the air, clean and faintly sweet. Eleanor took them, eyes wet, voice unsteady. "You keep showing up," she said. Jamie answered simply, "So do you." Outside, rain began to fall again, soft and rhythmic against the glass. The two women stood under the same umbrella, close enough to feel each other's warmth in the chill. The world could keep talking, it would always talk, but for that brief, quiet moment, they existed beyond it. Eleanor looked up at the sky and whispered, almost to herself, "It's strange. The more they try to bury me, the more alive I feel." Jamie squeezed her hand. "Maybe that's what truth does." And as they walked through the city, rain flickering through neon reflections, Eleanor realized that freedom wasn't the absence of judgment, it was learning to keep walking through it, hand in hand with someone who refused to let go. Winter came quietly that year, creeping along the edges of the windows, frosting the corners of their small apartment. The river slowed, the mornings turned blue, and Eleanor found herself waking earlier, watching Jamie sleep, her hair a dark spill against white sheets, her breath steady. It was in those fragile dawns that Eleanor understood how much of her strength had come from this, from softness she had once mistaken for weakness. One cold afternoon, Jamie came home carrying a thin envelope, her cheeks flushed from the wind. She set it on the counter, unopened, then busied herself with her gloves. Eleanor, who'd been reading, looked up. "You look like someone trying not to tell me something." Jamie smiled, small, nervous. "Maybe I am." The envelope was from London. Inside, an offer. An art residency at a design collective, 6 months, maybe more. Paid, prestigious, the kind of opportunity she'd once dreamed of before life had turned into coffee runs and boardroom notes. Eleanor's first reaction was pride, the second was fear. "When would you have to go?" "In 2 weeks." The words landed like a soft blow. Eleanor set down her book, her hands suddenly restless. "Do you want to go?" Jamie hesitated. "I do. But," she looked up, eyes searching hers. "I don't want to leave you." For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. The radiator hummed softly, the faint smell of cinnamon from the candle they'd forgotten to blow out filling the room. "You should go," she said finally. Jamie frowned. "You're saying that like you're already letting me go." "I'm saying it because I've spent half my life teaching people to stay for the wrong reasons." The quiet stretched between them, long and trembling. Jamie crossed the room and touched Eleanor's cheek, her thumb tracing the faint worry lines that had deepened since the articles, since the whispers. "You've changed me," she whispered. Eleanor smiled, fragile. "Then don't stop changing. Just promise me you'll come back." "I will." The night before the flight, they packed in silence. Each folded shirt felt like a goodbye. Jamie paused by the window, looking out at the snowfall, her reflection a blur against the glass. "You'll visit?" "If you'll have me." Jamie turned, eyes bright but steady. "I'll always have you." They didn't make grand speeches or promises. Just a long embrace that felt more like breathing the same air than holding on. And when Jamie's taxi arrived at dawn, the city still half asleep, Eleanor stood barefoot in the doorway, the cold biting her ankles, watching until the red taillights dissolved into gray. The apartment felt different without her. The air was too still, the silence too complete. Eleanor tried to fill it, with work, with books, with long walks by the river, but everything reminded her of Jamie. The sound of graphite on paper. The hum of music from the kitchen. Even the smell of her shampoo, faint on a scarf Eleanor refused to wash. For the first few weeks, they wrote constantly. Messages at odd hours, photos of skies in different shades of gray. Jamie sent sketches of London streets, crowded with umbrellas and neon lights reflecting on wet cobblestones. "You'd love it here," she wrote once. "It's a city that doesn't apologize for being alive." Eleanor replied with images of the river at sunset, her coffee mug beside a half-read book. "It's quieter here now. But the quiet makes me hear myself again." Then the messages slowed, not from disinterest, but from distance. Time zones, work, fatigue. Their calls grew shorter, more careful. Words once effortless became measured, as if both feared saying too much or not enough. One night, Eleanor stayed awake staring at the empty half of the bed. She opened her phone, scrolled through old photos, Jamie laughing at a street vendor, painting on the balcony, falling asleep mid-conversation. She typed a message, "I miss you more than I can say," but never sent it. She closed her eyes instead and whispered it into the dark, trusting that somehow it would reach her anyway. In London, Jamie was flourishing. Articles praised her work, galleries called her name. She spoke of it humbly on their rare calls, her eyes bright through the screen. "I wish you could see it," she said once. "Everything feels possible here." Eleanor smiled, though her heart ached in ways she couldn't name. Then go and live it. Don't look back for me every time you turn a corner. But Jamie looked back anyway. Every sketch she made carried traces of Eleanor, the way her hands curved, the reflection of her eyes in every windowpane she drew. By spring, the distance had become part of their rhythm. Letters replaced calls, handwritten, full of pressed petals, coffee stains, and sentences that trailed off mid-thought. Some nights, Jamie wrote, I dream of the river. Not ours, yours. The one that sounds like your voice when you're half asleep. Eleanor replied weeks later, I still make 2 cups of coffee every morning. I let one go cold, just in case you're late. Time moved strangely then, both fast and unbearably slow. Eleanor kept busy consulting for small startups, occasionally giving lectures. But her true work became waiting, not in sadness, but in quiet faith. She started keeping Jamie's letters in a wooden box by the window, beside the orchid that refused to die even through winter. One evening, after a long day, she found herself walking through the city without aim. The wind carried the faint sound of a street musician playing violin, a melody she recognized. It was the same tune Jamie had once hummed in Zurich. The same rhythm that had followed them through rain, through change. She stood there for a while, eyes closed, letting the music settle somewhere deep. That night, she wrote one last letter. When the city gets too loud, I think of you in color, blue, gold, green, and it feels like silence again. If love is distance, then we are still touching. Weeks later, an envelope arrived from London. No words, just a sketch, 2 figures standing by a river, hands almost, but not quite, touching. Beneath it, in small handwriting, soon. Eleanor placed the drawing beside her bed. She didn't cry. She didn't smile either. She simply exhaled, as if preparing her heart for something she couldn't name yet, a beginning disguised as waiting. And outside her window, the river kept moving, indifferent to time, carrying everything that had ever been said between them, and everything still waiting to be. The invitation arrived in early summer, a folded card, ivory and simple, stamped with a London Galleries emblem. We are pleased to announce the solo exhibition of Jamie Collins, Reflections of Silence. Opening reception, July 14th. Eleanor read it twice, her pulse betraying her calm. She hadn't seen Jamie in nearly 6 months. There had been letters, yes, sometimes long, sometimes just a single line, I miss your quiet. But no calls, no promises, no plans. She'd told herself that love could survive in stillness. But now, holding the invitation, she realized that stillness had turned to longing. She booked a flight that same night. London in July was soft and bright, the air scented with rain that hadn't yet fallen. Eleanor arrived at the gallery before the crowd. The walls were white, the floors polished. Paintings hung like whispers, mostly water, light, and reflections. She recognized herself in every one of them. Not literally, but in tone, the blue-gray palette of her eyes, the stormy golds of her hair in morning light, the fragments of silence they had shared. She stood before one piece longer than the rest. It showed 2 silhouettes, facing each other across a river, blurred, like memory, the water between them shimmering with unspoken words. Everyone stops at that one, said a voice behind her. Eleanor turned. Jamie stood there, hair shorter now, her dress simple and linen soft, paint smudged faintly on her wrist. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. You came, Jamie said. Eleanor nodded, words tangled somewhere between her ribs and throat. You didn't think I would. Jamie smiled, small and trembling. I didn't want to hope. They stood in silence, the murmur of the gallery fading around them. It felt strange and familiar, like walking into a dream they'd both been keeping alive separately. Your work, Eleanor began. It's yours too, Jamie said, finishing for her. Every line started with you. The crowd grew behind them, the noise of glasses and footsteps and voices swelling. But the two women moved as if caught in a private orbit, invisible to everyone else. When a photographer asked for a picture, Jamie gently shook her head. Not tonight. Later, after the guests had left and the lights had dimmed, they remained, two silhouettes again, but this time the distance had vanished. I should have called, Jamie said, her voice low. I should have asked you to stay, Eleanor replied. Jamie stepped closer, her hand brushing the edge of Eleanor's coat. You look different. So do you. Older. Wiser. They both laughed softly, the tension easing into something fragile and alive. Jamie's laughter faded first. She looked up, meeting Eleanor's gaze. Do you ever think about Zurich? Every time it rains. The gallery was silent now, the only sound the soft echo of their voices, the faint hum of London beyond the walls. Jamie's eyes glistened in the half-light. It was never just the rain, she said. I know. They stood close enough for their breath to mingle, for the air between them to shimmer again with the memory of touch. Eleanor reached up, fingers trembling as she tucked a strand of hair behind Jamie's ear, the same gesture she'd made years ago, the same tenderness that had begun everything. Jamie didn't move away this time. When Eleanor's fingertips traced the line of her jaw, it wasn't desire that burned first, it was recognition. The quiet ache of two halves remembering what it felt like to be whole. I've missed this, Jamie whispered. This? The sound of your silence when you're trying not to feel too much. Eleanor smiled faintly, her forehead resting against hers. I never stopped feeling it. I just learned to hide it better. Jamie's hand found the back of her neck, drawing her closer until the distance dissolved. The kiss was not sudden. It unfolded like a confession, slow, reverent, filled with all the words they'd written but never said aloud. The taste of rain, of breath, of coming home. Eleanor deepened it only slightly, her hands moving to Jamie's waist, feeling the warmth through the thin fabric of her dress. Every heartbeat felt amplified, every sigh a memory rediscovered. There was no rush, no hunger, only rhythm, the quiet pull of gravity and grace. When they finally parted, the air felt electric, as if the whole city had inhaled with them. Jamie's eyes were wet, her voice a whisper. You always knew how to find me. I was never looking for anyone else. They left the gallery together, walking along the Thames as the rain finally began to fall. It wasn't cold, just soft, cleansing. The lamps reflected on the water like fragments of their story, glowing and breaking with each ripple. They stopped under a bridge where the sound of rain turned hollow and intimate. Jamie leaned back against the stone wall, her breath uneven. Eleanor stepped closer, her coat brushing Jamie's knees, her hands trembling before finding her face. Tell me this isn't a dream, Jamie said. It's the first time I've felt awake in years. Their lips met again, slower now, deeper, the world narrowing to warmth and light and heartbeat. Eleanor's fingers traced the line of Jamie's collarbone, her touch a question answered by every sigh between them. The city outside faded into rhythm, the rain, the river, the distant hum of night. Their movements were poetry, slow strokes, half-whispered laughter, breath mingling in the dark. Later, they stood wrapped in the same coat, watching the water shimmer beneath the bridge. Eleanor pressed a kiss to Jamie's temple. So, she whispered, will you come home? Jamie smiled. Only if you promise not to hide there. I don't hide anymore. They walked until dawn, the rain thinning to mist, their hands entwined like a sentence finally finished. When they reached Jamie's flat, the city was waking. Eleanor brushed her thumb across Jamie's lips, that familiar softness, that endless question. I thought I'd lost you. You did, Jamie said gently. And then you found yourself. The morning light touched the skyline, gold on gray, and Eleanor understood, love was not what she had been running from or toward, it was what had been teaching her to stop running at all. They kissed once more, a promise rather than a goodbye. And as the first buses passed and the river caught the sun, she whispered what she should have said years ago. I'm home. Years later, the city had changed again, or maybe it was Eleanor who had. The skyline outside her window no longer looked like power, it looked like possibility. From the rooftop of the small creative studio she and Jamie had opened, the garden, as they called it, New York unfolded like a breathing thing, vibrant, imperfect, alive. Planters filled the terrace, vines curled along the railing, and in one corner, an easel caught the morning light. Jamie was there, sleeves rolled up, mixing colors that shimmered somewhere between gold and memory. The smell of turpentine and coffee mingled with the early breeze. Eleanor stood a few feet away, watering the orchids, the same flowers that had survived every move, every season, every silence. You're overwatering again, Jamie said without looking up. Eleanor smiled. You say that every time. And they're still alive. Maybe they just like the attention. Their laughter echoed lightly across the terrace. It had been years since the Zurich storm, the headlines, the London distance. Now, they lived above a small gallery space where artists came to create, share, and rest, people who needed what they once did, a quiet place to begin again. Sometimes, visitors would ask how the studio got its name. Jamie always said, because every woman deserves a secret garden. Eleanor never corrected her. But she knew the truth, the garden wasn't secret at all. It was a mirror of everything they'd built, wild, resilient, honest. Eleanor had grown softer with time, not weaker, but gentler with the world. She still consulted occasionally, but mostly she taught workshops on creative leadership, guiding young women to find their voice without losing their heart. Jamie's paintings had traveled to Paris, Tokyo, Sao Paulo. But she always returned here, to the rooftop, where the light felt most like home. One afternoon, as thunder gathered in the distance, Eleanor found Jamie standing by the window inside, staring at the rain streaking down the glass. It was the same scene, years later, the same city, the same sound. Only now, there was peace in the silence. Déjà vu? Eleanor asked, stepping beside her. Jamie nodded. Except this time, I'm not waiting for you to choose. Eleanor smiled, slipping her arm around her waist. This time, there was never a choice. The storm rolled in softly, rain tapping against the glass like a familiar rhythm. They didn't move. They simply stood there, two reflections in one pane, faces older, eyes brighter. The city outside blurred into watercolor, skyscrapers dissolving into mist and light. You ever think, Jamie whispered, how everything started with rain? And ended with sunlight, Eleanor replied. Jamie turned to her, smiling. No. It never ended. They stayed like that, the world narrowing to the warmth of a hand, the sound of rain, the pulse of a heart steady against another. In that moment, Eleanor understood what all the years had been teaching her: love wasn't a fire to chase, nor a storm to survive. It was the quiet after, the part where you finally exhale. Outside, the rain eased. The city lights returned, glinting on every wet surface, making even the asphalt shimmer. Eleanor looked at the reflection in the glass once more, two women standing together, the same image that once symbolized isolation now transformed into belonging. Jamie reached up and touched the window, her fingertip tracing their outlines in the reflection. You know, she said softly, we never finished that painting. Eleanor looked down at her. Then let's not finish it. Let's just keep living it. They turned away from the glass, leaving their mirrored selves behind. The orchid swayed near the open door, catching droplets from the lingering rain. Later that evening, as twilight deepened and the city glowed below, Eleanor sat at her desk, writing something in her notebook. Jamie came up behind her, resting her chin on her shoulder. What are you working on? Eleanor smiled. A letter to myself. To the woman who thought she had to earn love before she could feel it. Jamie kissed the side of her neck. What does it say? That she was wrong. Love isn't earned. It's allowed. They stayed there, quiet and intertwined, until the city lights blurred into stars and the rain smell faded into night. And from the rooftop, their garden in the sky, the orchids gleamed pale against the dark, their petals open wide as if finally unafraid of the storm. Sometimes, Eleanor still whispered to the window, just as she had years ago in that high tower of glass. But now, the reflection smiled back. Because courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to love in the light, after learning to live through the rain. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Secret Garden Stories, leave your comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today.